President, as I begin this morning, let me just start by reacting to a couple of things that have been said here on the floor this morning already by my Democrat colleagues. You know, the leader, Republican leader, when he was down here earlier, talked about the impact of inflation on the economy. And that, I have to tell you, that's very real, Mr. President. The inflationary impact is being felt all across this country. Energy costs are up, gasoline costs are up by huge amounts. Food costs are up in this country. Housing costs are up. There isn't hardly any area of our economy where people aren't being impacted by inflation, meaning that the dollars that they earn are stretching less further all the time. And that is not, it's not a fake thing, it's not a temporary thing, it's a real thing. People are experiencing it in their economic lives on a daily basis. And to hear the Democrat leaders say, well, you know, all the spending that they're going to do is not going to cost anything, it's going to be covered by tax increases, and those tax increases are just going to hit people in the higher income categories also is something that just isn't accurate. Now, let me just for a minute suggest something that I think is sort of fundamental when it comes to economics, and that is when you have too many dollars chasing too few of goods, you get inflation. The demand for a product goes up, and when the demand goes up, the price usually follows along with it. Well, we have right now a lot of government dollars that have been swirling around the economy for some time, which is why I think in many respects we're seeing this inflation, the highest inflation that we've seen literally in 30 years in this country, affecting, as I said earlier, kind of all sectors of the economy and things that people have to purchase in their daily lives. And if you put more dollars out there, which is what's being talked about by our Democrat colleagues, another $3.5 trillion that would flood the economy, I think the expectation is a very real one that you're going to see that inflationary pressure accelerate, intensify. Because when you've got that much money, that many dollars chasing too few of goods, inflation is an inevitable result. And the idea that we need to spend another $3.5 trillion and that somehow that's going to be a solution right now also is not consistent at all with the facts and the data. We saw here just recently the Congressional Budget Office come out with a report that suggested that government revenues, Mr. President, are at the highest level, biggest increase, I should say, year over year since 1977. We are now over $4 trillion this last year in revenues. $4 trillion, never happened before in this country. Biggest one-year increase in revenues since 1977. Paid for largely by corporate tax receipts, which were up 75% year over year, and then also by individual income tax receipts, much of which was coming from high-income earners. A lot of that increase that we've seen in income tax receipts in this country in government revenues comes from those people who are high-income earners. All that to say, if you've got that much revenue coming in to the government in this country, why then would you need to go out and raise taxes even more and spend even more when you've got an economy that's in the process of recovering, people concerned about inflation, and the Democrat solution to that is to spend more, put more money out there, raise taxes even higher at a time when you've got historic revenue coming in to the federal government. First time ever in our nation's history that we've had over $4 trillion in revenue come in. So the other thing that was mentioned by my colleague from Illinois just a minute ago is that the issue of the tax gap, which was alluded to earlier this morning on the floor by, again, the Republican leader, the Democrat solution is to go after people, essentially shake them down and get them to pay more in taxes. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that there aren't people out there who aren't paying the taxes that they should owe under the law and that the law needs to be enforced. What I am suggesting is that in the effort to close that so-called tax gap, there are huge differences of opinion about what effect that would have, how much could be generated, and who is ultimately going to pay for that. Well, now there's additional research out coming from the Joint Committee on Taxation that, in fact, the Democrat efforts to close the tax gap will hit lower income taxpayers the most. To say that none of the tax increases or none of the tax policies that are being proposed by the Democrats in their $3.5 trillion tax and spending spree proposal won't harm people who are making less than $400,000 a year is laughable under any plausible review of these tax policies and proposals. But this one in particular hits hardest at low-income taxpayers. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, people making less than $50,000 a year will pay anywhere from 40 to 57% of all the revenue that's generated off of that one proposal. People making less than $100,000 a year will pay somewhere between 65 and 78% of all the taxes that are generated under that particular proposal in the Democrat plan. People making less than $200,000 a year would pay up to 90% of the amount generated under that particular proposal in the Democrats' plan. So people making less than $200,000 a year are going to be paying tens of billions of dollars more in taxes just on that one proposal, which is out there allowing the IRS essentially to snoop into people's personal transactions up to the $600 level. And I don't think there's any way you can get around the fact, Mr. President, that under that scenario, people in the lower income categories are going to end up paying the lion's share of the cost of that. So this isn't going to be without cost. This isn't going to be without consequence. This is not going to be without impact on lower income taxpayers in this country. They're going to get hit, and they're going to get hit hard under this Democrat proposal. So when we talk about it, we're talking about real impacts, real economic impacts on the American people's lives, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to fight against really bad tax policies being put in place to finance massive amounts of spending, expansion and growth of government at a time when government revenues just hit a historic high, never seen before, biggest year-over-year increase in revenue since 1977. And Democrats want to raise taxes on everybody, including those in the lower income categories. Mr. President, the Biden border crisis continues unabated. In August, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered 208,887 people attempting to illegally cross our southern border, a 318% increase from August of 2020. Now, for context, that number is bigger than the population of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the largest city in my home state. Mr. President, at this point, crisis is too mild of a description. Things at the border are out of control. And there's little to suggest that things will improve anytime soon as the Biden administration continues to permit an influx of migrant entries and has sought to install appointees who have lax views about enforcing our immigration laws. And yet another sign of how bad things are, dozens of National Guard members from South Dakota recently deployed to our southern border. Now, I know these South Dakotans are always ready to serve whenever and wherever they are needed, and I am grateful for their service. But, Mr. President, you'd think that the border crisis would be at the top of the Democrats' priority list here in Washington, D.C., particularly when they have to call in the National Guard from states around this country. But you'd be wrong. In fact, the border crisis seems like barely a blip on Democrats' radar, and it's not only the only crisis they're ignoring. Our national security situation has taken a giant step backward with the President's disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal and the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And here at home, mentioned it earlier, inflation is rapidly becoming a serious and a long-term, not a temporary problem. Americans' purchasing power is shrinking as they have to stretch their paychecks to cover increases in everything from the price of groceries to the price of gasoline. But none of that really seems to matter to Democrats. Their main priority seems to be forcing through a $3.5 trillion partisan tax and spending spree that would permanently expand the reach of government into Americans' lives. Mr. President, where to start when it comes to Democrats' tax and spending spree? Well, there are tax hikes that would put American businesses at a disadvantage on the global stage and shrink jobs and opportunities for American workers. There's the death tax expansion that could put a lot of family farms and businesses in jeopardy. There are the major new entitlements: free college, free preschool, subsidized daycare, paid leave. Yes, one of the major existing entitlement programs, Medicare, is rapidly heading toward insolvency, yet instead of shoring up that program, Democrats are expanding entitlements and putting the government on the hook for an unsustainable level of spending. And then there are items that get less attention, but they're just as troubling. Mr. President, traditionally in the United States, individuals have picked the winners and losers through the free market. But the more you insert government into economic and family life, the more government ends up being the one making the decisions. Government ends up picking the winners and losers. Take the Democrats' child care benefit. A 2020 Bipartisan Policy Center survey found that among working families who used, center-based child care, 53% used a faith-based center. 53%. But now Democrats are coming in with their child care subsidies and in the process changing decades-old child care funding programs to favor secular child care providers who provide care at daycare centers. So if you're one of the 53% who chooses a faith-based provider for your child, you could be out of luck. Not because you've changed your child care preferences, but simply because Democrats have set up their benefit to favor secular, center-based child care providers. And Democrats are repeating this pattern of picking winners and losers throughout their bill. Labor unions win under this bill. Democrats have included a special benefit that would expressly allow union members to deduct their union dues on their taxes. Meanwhile, non-union workers can expect to pay their usual tax bills. You only get special privileges if you're a union member. And if you're one of the 90% of American workers who don't belong to a union, then you're not going to see any help as they subsidize the dues of those who do belong to a union. But I guess Democrats want to make sure that they get those union votes to come out election time. And of course, there's not the bill's only benefit for unions. There's funding for electronic voting systems for union elections and incentives to purchase an electric car from a union factory. Unions, of course, are not the only winner. Electric vehicle manufacturers, for one, also win. The bill clearly endorses electric vehicles as the climate change solution for the transportation sector. Other clean energy technologies, notably biofuels, take a back seat in this bill. Mr. President, I could go on all day when it comes to the spending priorities in this bill, like the fact that the bill dedicates more than $200 million to urban agriculture. That's right, urban agriculture. Mr. President, I'm not saying that you can't have a garden if you live in a city, but urban gardens are never going to produce the volume of food needed to feed our country. And anyone who thinks they will doesn't know much about agriculture, which may be the problem here. Democrats' tax and spending spree reads like the product of too much socialist daydreaming and not enough time spent learning about how things like agriculture, energy, and economies actually work. Speaking of which, I haven't mentioned the Democrats' tree equity measure. Yeah, tree equity. Democrats have allowed $3 billion prioritized for what they recently have been referring to as tree equity. Now, Mr. President, I support and encourage planting trees, but I don't think the federal government can afford to spend $3 billion on tree equity, especially when Democrats are planning to spend $200 million for a park in House Speaker Pelosi's district that features luxury housing and a golf course, and provide tax benefits for Ivy League universities and other well-funded colleges, including a new tax credit for higher education institutions for teaching, quote, environmental justice, end quote, programs. Then there are the tax credits for electric bicycles that can cost up to $8,000. It may be just me, but if you can afford an $8,000 bicycle, I'm not sure you need a tax credit for it from the federal government. Then, of course, Democrats are planning to provide billions of dollars to fund a civilian climate corps to provide government jobs for climate activists. And $20 billion for the creation of a national climate bank to fund Democrats' pet environmental projects. Now, Mr. President, as you can see, this list goes on and on and on. The more you read the Democrats' bill with its massive expansion of government, its historic tax hikes, and its payoffs to liberal constituencies, the more you realize that there's pretty much no area of life that Democrats think wouldn't be better run by the federal government. But my fellow Republicans and I still believe in a vibrant private economy and in the right of individuals and families to run their lives as they see fit. And so we will continue to oppose Democrats' social spending spree and continue to fight to secure a future of prosperity, opportunity, and freedom. Freedom for each and every American. Mr. President, I yield the floor.